This video covers chapter 3.3 of the book Spring Boot Quick Start. Chapter 3.3 shows how to use auto-wired annotation. Auto-wired annotation is used to tell Spring to create and inject instance of a class into variable by specifying either the class using this syntax or by specifying the interface. So here we are telling Spring that he needs to find the class with this name, and it needs to create an object, an instance from this class, and inject it into this variable. And in the below example, we are telling auto-wire to find class that implements this interface, and also to create instance of this class and inject that object, that instance, into this variable. Now in both cases, class that is from which the instance is being created must be a Spring component or bean, so that the Spring can find it. To annotate a class as a Spring component bean, you can use different annotations, some of which are listed here. Auto-wired can be used to inject instance of a class either into property, setter parameter, or constructor parameter. So if you want to use auto-wired to inject instance of a class into property, syntax is very simple and looks like this, as we have already covered previously. If you want auto-wired to inject instance of a class into a setter parameter, you just use auto-wired annotation before you declare the setter. So this is a setter which is used to set my service property. And the same applies for the constructor. Simple add auto-wired annotation to the constructor, and then Spring will go through its parameters, and if it finds my service, then it will find the class my service and create instance of that class and inject it into my service parameter. If you're using auto-wired with interface, like shown here, then you're not specifying the specific class that for which an instance needs to be created. So in that case, there are certain rules which Spring uses in order to determine which class needs to be instantiated. So, of course, by using profiles, Spring will only look for the classes in specified profile, or those classes that don't have any specified profile, because these are the classes that will be included in your application. You can also use primary annotation. So if there are multiple classes that implement the same interface, Spring can use primary annotation to take the class that is annotated with primary annotation. And lastly, you can also use qualifier annotation, which is used to name classes and components, for instance, like this. So for instance, you can use this syntax to give a name to your class, to your service, and then you can use this qualifier annotation together with auto-wired annotation to tell Spring that it should auto-wire component with this name. So component which was given this name. So why would we want to use auto-wired annotation in the first place? So for different reasons. For instance, inside the controller, we can use auto-wire to instantiate services, and inside, because controller works with services, And inside services, we can use AutoWire to instantiate entities and repositories, since a service works with those types of Java classes. If AutoWire is using interface, there are certain rules which are followed so that Spring can decide which class to instantiate and inject. So if active profile only has one class that implements specified interface, then that class will be used. If active profile have multiple classes that implement interface, then by default AutoWire will instantiate class annotated with primary, as mentioned here. Or you can use a qualifier together with annotation to instantiate class which was given the same name as the name specified inside the qualifier. So this is actually the same but in more detail as described here. So now we will go through a few tutorials which actually show how to work with AutoWire annotation. But first, we will show how to instantiate class manually, that is without using AutoWire, in order to get a better feeling what is AutoWire annotation actually doing in the background for us. So in this application, we will have a controller and a service class. Inside the controller, we will simply create an instance of our service. Our service is defined here, so it is a simple class annotated with service, which has a single hello method, say hello method, which returns hello. So in order to be able to call this class and its method from the controller, we need to create an object from that class, an instance from that class, by using this syntax. And then we can use this instance to call the method and to return the result. So here we have manually created instance of class myService and placed this instance in this variable, injected this instance in this variable. AutoWire is commented here and is not used, but this is where we would put it in order for AutoWire to do exactly the same thing. Create an instance of a class and then to inject that instance into the property which is annotated with AutoWire. So this is how this application looks. It has a single package controllers. Inside it has a class controller, and it also has a package services, and inside it has class service as shown before. And the POM.xml file is only using web dependencies so that we have access to REST controller and request mapping annotations and to Tomcat server. Now that we have seen how we would manually instantiate a class and use it inside the controller, we will now go to subsequent tutorials which all use AutoWire, which is doing exactly the same thing for us. So first, in these three tutorials, we will show how AutoWire can be used to inject instantiated class in different places. As I said before, instantiated class can be injected into property, but it can also be injected into a setter parameter or in constructor parameters. Injecting instantiated class into property is simplest, so we will start with that. So in this project, again, we have one controller and a service that is being called from within that controller. Our service class is exactly the same as in the previous example, and it is annotated with service annotation. It needs to be annotated as a Spring component by using service annotation or similar annotations. so that AutoWired can actually find that class in order to be able to instantiate it. So inside the myController class, we now have this syntax which tells Spring to find class with this name. So this is this class, to create an instance of this class and to inject that instance into variable myService. So this syntax is doing exactly the same as we were manually doing in the previous example, where we were manually creating instance of the myService class and injecting that instance into myService property. So by using AutoWired, we don't need this part. This is being done by the Spring framework. So this will create an instance of the class and put it in this variable so that we can, inside our endpoint, use this variable exactly as before and call it say hello method. So this part of the code didn't change from the previous example. So this is how you can inject an instance of a class into a property. We will now show how to use AutoWired to inject instance of a class into a setter parameter. We again have the same myController and myService classes, and myService classes is exactly the same as in two previous examples. But in the myController, beside the properties, we now also have one setter that is being used to set this property, which is why it is named exactly the same as the property. So by putting AutoWired annotation, assigning that annotation to the setter, this tells Spring to instantiate class of this name and to inject that instance into this variable. And then inside the setter, we can store this instance into the property. So this is a bit more complicated than just injecting instance into a property, where we also needed to only needed to add AutoWired next to the property, but this is also a possibility. Now once we have the myService instance, we can use it in exactly the same way in our controller's endpoint and call method hello that returns string. So to use AutoWired with setters, simply assign AutoWired annotation to the setter, and then setter will automatically populate its parameters with instances of the classes. And lastly, AutoWired can be also used to automatically inject class into constructor parameters. The approach is the same as with setters, so you simply create your constructor and then annotate it with AutoWired annotation. Then Spring will inject instances of the classes into the parameters, input parameters of the constructor. And inside the constructor, we are then using this injected instance to store it into actual property. And then we can use that property inside our controller exactly the same as we did in all our previous cases. So in those three examples that we have just covered, we have seen how instance of a class can be injected in different locations inside property, setter parameter, or constructor parameter. In all three examples, we were specifying a class to be injected. More specifically, this myService class. We were specifying class when we were injecting its instance into a property, when we were injecting instance into setter parameter, we specified a class, and also when we were injecting it as a constructor parameter, we were specifying a class. Now in following three tutorials, instead of specifying a class that needs to be inserted, we will specify interface. And then Spring needs to decide which class that implements this interface needs to be inserted. So this is a bit more complicated, and therefore here we are using some additional annotations which can help Spring decide which class actually needs to be injected, instantiated and injected. So, and these annotations are shown here: primary, qualifier and profile. These annotations can be added to classes, and then they are used by Spring to decide which class to instantiate. We have already seen how the profile annotation works, and it defines which classes will be available to the application. Primary annotation can be also added to a class, and this is what Spring Framework will use to decide which class to implement. For instance, if one class has primary annotations and the others don't, it will use the class with that annotation to create an instance and inject it into a variable. And we will also use how to use qualifier annotation. This annotation is combined with AutoWired to specify a name of the class that we want to instantiate. So let's start with primary annotation. So this example is a little bit more complicated than those previous, because here, except the controller, we also have my service interface, and then we will have two classes that implement that interface. And one of those classes, my service implementation 1, will be annotated with primary annotation, telling Spring to use that class when it needs to instantiate and so let's see how this looks like. So this is a my service interface, which simply declares a single method, say hello, without implementation, because this is interface. And then we have two classes, my service implementation 1 and my service implementation 2, which implement this interface. In other words, they define how the say hello method should be implemented. They define its body. So the first implementation will just return hello, and the second implementation would return hello world. And the only other difference between these two implementations are that the first implementation will have a primary annotation. So now if we go to our controller and use AutoWired with the interface, Spring now needs to decide which of these two classes need to be instantiated and to inject the instance into this my service. So Spring sees that we want an instance of a class that implements this interface. Spring then finds two classes that implements this interface. Since we have annotated those classes as using service annotation, they are visible to the Spring as Spring components, beans. And now Spring needs to define which of these two classes to use to instantiate. Since this class is annotated as primary class, Spring Framework will decide to use this class, and it will instantiate this class and inject that instance into the my service property. Because this is the only difference with these two classes, so the classes annotated with primary will be taken. We could have had more classes, like let's say 10 classes, and if only one of them was annotated with primary, it will be still picked up by the Spring Framework. So Spring Framework will choose to instantiate this class since it is annotated as primary, and then it will inject that instance into my service property, which we can then use inside our controller's endpoint to call the method and return result. So in this case, we are calling the method in this class, so the result will be hello. So we have just now shown how Spring Framework decides which class to instantiate by using primary annotation. Next, we will describe how a qualifier annotation is used by Spring Framework to decide which class to instantiate when auto-wired is used on an interface. So here we have a similar structure as before. We have an interface and we have two classes that implement this interface. But now, instead of annotating a class as primary, as we did in a previous example, we will use this syntax to give each class a name. So this class will be, so we are not giving name to a class. By using service, we are saying that this class is a Spring component. And then this syntax is telling Spring Framework that the name of this component will be impl1, and the name of this component, Spring component, will be impl2. So this syntax is used to give names to Spring components. And then inside the controller, we can use qualifier annotation to reference these components, to say with this syntax, I want component whose name is impl1, or I want component whose name is impl2. So this my service interface is exactly the same as in previous example. It is a normal Java interface which declares that there should be a single method called say hello. Then also as in the previous example, we will create two classes which implement that interface. In other words, define how to implement this say hello method. So this class implements say hello method by simply returning hello, and this one returns hello world. Now both of these classes are annotated with a service annotation to tell Spring Framework that these are Spring component. This is needed for AutoWired to locate these classes, because AutoWired can only locate classes which are declared to be Spring components. But unlike in a previous example where we only used service annotation, this part, here we are actually giving name to a Spring component. So this Java class, which is a Spring component, is given a name impl1, and this Java class, which is also a Spring component, is given name impl2. So now, if we take a look at the my controller, here is the part where AutoWired is being used and where we are saying Spring to find a class that implements this interface, create instance of that class and inject that instance into this variable. But with this annotation, we are telling Spring Framework which class to actually use. So in the previous example, we didn't have this part, so Spring Framework injected a class that was annotated as primary class. But here we are explicitly saying that we want to instantiate a class, or more precisely Spring component, with this name. So we are telling Spring Framework, find component that has this name and use that component to create instance that will be injected in this property. So by using this annotation, we are telling Spring Framework to use this class, to instantiate this class, this Spring component, and to use its instance to inject into this my service variable. Okay, so this is how we can use qualifier annotation to tell Spring which class to instantiate in case AutoWired is used in combination with interface, because in that case we have to tell Spring Framework in some way which class that implements this interface actually needs to be injected here. And now we will show an example of how to use profile to tell Spring which class to instantiate when AutoWired is used in combination with interface. So here again we have a myInterface class, and we have a myInterface, and we have two classes that implement this interface. And in this tutorial, these classes are assigned different profiles. So this says that this class should be included in the application only when active profile is profile 1, and this annotation tells Spring Framework to include this class into application if active profile is either profile 1 or profile 3. So when we start our application, it will only have either this class or it will only have this class, which is how profiles are being used. So this my service interface is exactly the same as in all of the previous examples. And again, we have two classes that implement this interface, which are also exactly the same as in all of the previous examples, except for these highlighted lines. And now we are using which are used to assign profiles to those classes. So both classes are annotated with service annotation to make them a Spring components, so the Spring can actually locate them when he tries to AutoWire interface. So now inside of controller, we have this syntax, which we have used before, which says to Spring Framework, find class that implements this interface, create an instance of that class, and inject that instance into my service property. But since we have, generally speaking, two classes that implement this interface, Spring now needs to decide which class to use to create its instance. Since we are using profiles, when we start the application, only one of these classes will actually be visible by Spring Framework. And this is the class that Spring Framework will then use to create an instance and inject it into this service. We are using application properties to specify active profile. So with this line, we are specifying that active profile will be profile 1, which means that once the application is created, it will only contain this class, this implementation of our interface, because only for this class we have specified that it should be included in the profile 1, because this other class is only included in profiles profile 2 and profile 3. So even though we have created two implementations of this interface, once we compile our application, it will only contain one implementation, the one assigned to profile 1, and therefore it is that class that the Spring Framework will use to create instance and inject that instance into this property. And then we can use this instance to call the say hello method, which returns hello. Okay, so in this video we have shown how to use AutoWired annotation to tell Spring to automatically create instance of a class and to insert that instance into either a property or setter or constructor parameters. And we have also covered how Spring Framework decides which class to instantiate in case we are using AutoWired together with interface and not specifying exactly the class that we want to instantiate.